You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations about ending things and collective liberation. On today's episode, I'm presenting the talk that Cindy Barukh Milstein and I did at Another Carolina Anarchist Bookfair. We called it An Anarchism of Despair. When we planned to collaborate for the talk, we checked in on where we were mentally, emotionally, and politically in relation to this specific moment, filled with frustrations around anarchist involvement in movements and the walls we run into time and time again. We wanted to lean into the despair, look it in the face, and learn how we might consider acting from this position. This is the description we wrote for the talk. After October 7th, the upswell of Palestinian solidarity has been heartening, but in the mechanics of the movement itself, we have found ourselves stuck in outdated forms of protest, marching in circles, making demands that will never be heeded. It feels like each iteration of rebellion meets its end at the blatancy of power. We are shown again that those who govern won't help us, and all this while watching a genocide in real time, feeling desperate and powerless. We have the energy and will, but not the means. What can we do then with this spike of liberatory or urges? This discussion will interrogate anarchism at this particular moment from the position of despair. Where does it meet its limits? Where does it show up to keep the energy going? Are we endlessly hitting our heads against the wall? Or does our effort need to be seen in the long view? When faced with the impossibility of liberation and action, where do we go? We organized the talk around three central provocations, which essentially point to the ways our political actions, ideas, and horizons are circumscribed, and therefore commit us to walking in circles. We then offer some thoughts about what anarchists actually do well, and how we can use those practices to try to leave behind the useless forms of protest. I've included comments from two comrades who attended, Bon and Jubilee V. Debs, who made important contributions to the ideas. I keep coming down to anarchism as something that creates the possibility of action. It doesn't guarantee consequences, but drives us to the edge, where then we can do something rather than nothing. We turn away when there are no guarantees, stuck in our miserable comforts in this world, whether through tired tropes of resistance or individual consumption as solace for work. While the state looks at us as if we're already dead, maybe we can instead find a way to act like we are living in the bursting of a moment that cannot be contained. If you like this show, please share with your friends, and rate and follow us wherever you get podcasts. You can also support the project and my writing by subscribing to my Patreon, patreon.com/thebreakuptheory. If you have any extra cash, you can sign up for $5 a month, though nothing there is paywalled. On the Patreon, I regularly post both short and long written pieces, along with episodes and other conversations I'm having. I'm so grateful for all of you supporting me and this project. As always, we have an online submission form at forum.jotform.com/thebreakuptheory/stories and a phone line at 917-426-6548. You can write and call us to share your breakup stories, your questions about how to end things, your hopes for liberation. We really love doing these shows where we get to respond to listener submissions, so please send in what you want. The Breakup Theory is also part of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. You can check it out at channelzeronetwork.com, where a bunch of different really amazing shows are put together. We're happy to be part of this, so please go check out some of these other shows. And now, for some despair. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming here. This book fair has been pretty amazing so far.
Yay!
And it's just so awesome to see so many people.
Yay!
Contrary to that, we're going to talk about despair. So I'm just to give you a little structure, I'm going to set up a little bit of the context of what we're talking about. Then I'm going to pass it to Milstein, who's going to do a little ritual. Then we're going to set up a three provocations and then have a little discussion between us and then open it up. That's the overall structure. So, I'm Shuli Branson, and this is Cindy Barukh Milstein. And yeah, so when we were coming together to talk about doing a workshop together or talk at the book fair, this was the thing that was on my mind. It's what I've been writing about and wrestling, and I brought it to Milstein, who was it generated with them too. And it's probably obvious to a lot of you what we might be despairing about. For me, the genocide after October 7th has kicked off a new version of it because of not just the terrible atrocities and murder going on there, but also watching our attempts in the belly of the beast to deal with it, right? And so in that despair, I feel like a lot of us are acting out of desperation and want to think about how we can avoid doing things that aren't working, throwing ourselves at a wall, continually getting arrested for no reason. And beyond this genocide, there's just worsening conditions all around. Everyone's struggling. Everyone I know is struggling. And I think that's also making it hard. So this is an attempt to put a place of reflection into it and think about how we can reorient ourselves and face the despair rather than let it guide our actions unknowingly. Does that sound good as a context?
Great. I also have been pretty much thinking about despair and anarchism in relation to it and ranting a lot. And I am going to borrow and kind of queer a Jewish grief ritual. We're both Jewish, both queer, trans, and I think that's adding layers of despair at this moment to both of us. So this is a ritual called Kriya. It's tearing garments of fabric as expressions of grief and anger and rage when you lose someone, and people for centuries in Jewish worlds and others have torn fabric at loss and usually over their heart and then left the fabric torn to show how angry and despairing they are. And my premise with this is that we should not be turning away from this despair or papering it over or being in denial. I've actually spent a lot of time staying present with that despair, and I think we should, in the same way we should stay present with our grief. And I think that's one thing I've been despairing about, is anarchists are just incessantly engaging in activity that's hitting ourselves heads against the wall, instead of actually being we're fucking despairing and depressed and having a hard time, and we should be talking about it with each other. And that is generative, and it's the healthy, right response for this moment. If you are not fucking depressed and despairing, you do not live in this world, which is not our world. So despair is not negative, but generative. That's one provocation I want to put out. And we should stay present with it. An anarchist despair, and go into our own forms of despair and really interrogate them to come out with something that actually is going to make sense for us as anarchists. Okay, as Jewish, we are people that wrestle with ideas constantly, and we love disagreement and generative. So we had a 5-hour great conversation, generative, about this. And I encourage people to go home and do this with other people. So the grief ritual, which is really short, is I'm going to tear some fabric, which is very cathartic. That's how I made all those strips out there the other night. And at the end of it, I was like, wow, I fucking feel great because I'm enraged. Okay. And as a blessing of sorts, I'm going to read the dedication from Khalid Benali's new book, No Spiritual Surrender. And I started crying when I read the dedication. So I'll read the blessing and tear fabric. For you who also despairs. And I'm not a fucking nihilist, if you know me, I'm a prefigurative anarchist, but I feel like we have to look at the wreckage right now and stay present with it.
All right. Thank you for opening up the space with that. So we're going to set the table with 3 provocations that we organized our conversation around and then use that to go deeper. The first one, this provocation, is that there is no way to act politically that isn't already circumscribed by liberalism or authoritarianism, including within our own imaginaries and including anarchists.
Do you want to read that one more time?
Yes. There's no way right now to act politically that isn't already circumscribed by liberalism or authoritarianism or both, liberal fascism, including within our own anarchist imaginaries. Do you want to do the second one?
Yeah. Second one is a little longer, but maybe I'll just read parts of it. Let's see. Our thinking and acting is in misalignment with the contemporary conditions and the new power dynamics. We're acting out of context as if we're in a different, already past time, whether we understand that as neoliberalism, representative democracy, older forms of fascism, versus the fact that we are in a period of what might be a neo-fascism. We don't even know what it is yet. We're not shifting or transforming or being dynamic in relation to changing phenomena within states, capitalism, colonialism, fascism. We could name everything else. We're acting. Everything we're doing is responding to a world that is gone. Yeah. And so the short things, we're acting in misalignment or out of context. We're fighting against things. All of us will be like, oh, we're in fascist times, but we're actually acting as if states, as an example, a lot of people are like, oh, something will stop the genocide. Some state, some super international agency. We always kind of think something else is out there. And it's so clear now in fascism, it's a different level of what we're facing. So, okay. Out of context actions.
And then the third provocation is that anarchists are in profound denial on numerous levels, and our engagement with anarchism reflects that. we're in denial around what our limitations are, and like how we plan our actions and what we think we're doing. We're also in denial about what our strengths are. We don't amplify or pay attention to what we're actually doing well and put our energy elsewhere. As Milstein said in the beginning, we're also in denial of our grief and trauma. I think we're driven to act reactively without letting that guide our actions, right? Because we just feel impulsively that we need to do something, whatever it is. And that's something that we're doing isn't working. I think also we letting the things that anarchists do well and the work that we do go into other places and be used by other people towards different ends than what we intend. So like, I see this kind of, my like despair of history is that all the most radical and revolutionary action that happens just ultimately gets funneled into liberal policy reform. We could be doing the most rad stuff, but like all we can actually hope for is like the bare minimum that will be rolled back within, a decade. And so we don't really confront the power we have the power to do or not to do. So just to reiterate, anarchists are in denial about the conditions, about what our strengths and weaknesses are, and about where our work is going.
And maybe I would add to that, I think a lot of us, this is not speaking, we're speaking on the macro level, not individuals. So, right. But kind of within anarchism, there's kind of a profound denial about how much we ourselves have been transformed by this time. Pandemic, the uprising and what happened afterward, and especially starting with October 7th and what it's revealed in terms of a lot of what we're talking about. We've been moving toward this within anarchism, but suddenly it's become stark. But we ourselves have been transformed too, and haven't really wanted to take time to reflect on how we have shifted to, because we also live in this culture, and no matter how we find it, it impacts us.
So those are the three provocations, and now we want to kind of think a little bit about how the things we were describing are showing up, and then try to put a little space towards like how we might rethink and reorient ourselves with this kind of reflection. So I was saying in the beginning that for me, the solidarity movement with Gaza has kicked off a bunch of reflections for me about like what we're doing wrong. I've been in New York, where I think this is typical of New York and it's different than other places, but there's this like almost kind of professional activity of like, we got to go in the streets, and people are acting like being in the streets is doing the most for Gaza. And ultimately the streets, it's like a form of liberal protest form, right? And asking for someone to come and stop the genocide. There hasn't been, even though we're 4 years after George Floyd, there hasn't been anything in the streets that has like mirrored the kind of self-motivating activity there, right? And yet, even though we're not doing anything really conflictual, we're getting beaten and arrested by the cops all the time, and then putting all of these resources towards jail support, right? And then the trauma support you have to do for people who've been beaten by the police. Like this is taking up all of our energy. Also, in this movement, I've seen it's been like sort of led by nonprofits and authoritarian organizations who are using anarchist language to describe what they're doing, but mean other things. And then a bunch of anarchists will like sign on and do all the legwork, and then it gets taken away, right? So there's also this kind of misalignment, I think, in the language that we're using. We don't like actually have shared meanings for what we're doing. So like in my world, people call a march a direct action, which I would argue it isn't, for example. Also, I would question to what extent just marching in circles is solidarity with people in Gaza, right? So like these kinds of things. And then, to use my kind of like language metaphor, I also think we're just like operating with a liberal grammar of resistance that is just like takes these kind of easily co-opted, easily kind of dealt with forms, right? That we're not actually posing a threat to power. The encampments, like for a moment, seemed to touch a nerve that was like interesting, but I think they were then kind of quickly taken over again by these multiple forces of liberalism and authoritarianism and just like confusion, I think, about what to do. Do you want to jump in with?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to just build on that, maybe be more conversational, because I have a million different provocations we didn't even do and a million things I'm despairing about and really enraged by in the anarchist world. So I haven't slept. So trying to stay focused. So, but I feel like this moment has revealed to me, it's been really perplexing, because when October 7th happened, yeah, I had both like an incredible like trauma response, anarchist response, Jewish response. And I was just like, what started happening, it was such a different, I realized for most of this time period, now reflecting back, what happened was usually there's an anarchist impulse at this moment and anarchism comes out and then the liberals come in and shut it down, the authoritarian. And there's this moment when revolution feels possible or revolutionary transformation feels possible. And we fight to keep that space open and get shut down. This time it was opened up by people who often said they were anarchist. And I never usually do, oh, you're not an anarchist. But I was so confused because all these people saying they were anarchists, but they were doing completely liberal, non-profit-y, contained, respectability, civil, non-conflictual, etc. forms. And I want to say it's been very powerful. The Jewish Voices for Peace, for instance, these gigantic letters, T-shirts where everybody looks the same, highly paid, non-profit, lots of money, and doing things, shutting down bridges, doing beautiful ritual in the street to shut down spaces, symbolic arrests. It's on the one hand, it's moving, but on the other hand, it's just part of a non-profit-y way of performative arrests. And I was like, I'm just going to critique Jews in this way at this moment because I could critique a lot. It's like so many people that were Jewish anarchists are like, I'm joining that JVP to do that because they're doing something. And I was like, but we do things. We self-organize. And everyone's like, well, no, they're they've already got it organized. I was like, wow, I've never seen, it's so perplexing to me. And so I've been thinking about this moment, and they got the narrative to begin with. Ceasefire. What the fuck does that mean? It's a fucking genocide, and we oppose colonialism in states, etc. But at the same time, I'm watching a lot of anarchists use equally, increasingly not great language to put out narratives. And so this time period where language has, we're in a genocide, we can't even say that. That's just so self-evident, right? But even a lot of anarchists I know were saying first it was Israel, then it was Zionism, and it slipped into Zionists. And I'm like, that's like 90% of Jews. And meanwhile, ignoring the fact that a lot of other states are involved in this, right? So I'm seeing this interesting slippage of, as anarchists, aren't we for a critique of all states and understand that all states are part of this, a critique of colonialism everywhere, and that colonialism doesn't stay put and contained? And right now we're in a time when they speak to each other and they coordinate on a global level. So this feels to me at this time period very frustrating. I was like, why have we as anarchists not done what we're good at, which is be there in the front to put out the bold ideas, to put out the bold slogans, the bold forms of organizing? But I think we ourselves have become so transformed by being in this world that's so overly determined by non-profit-y liberalism, etc., right? I can go on many other examples, but as Shuli's pointing out, it just felt extremely despairing. And even when I was trying to get so many people who are really hardcore anarchists to be more conflictual and oppositional, I think it's also because we don't know what to do. And instead of stopping and talking about that, we're giving our beautiful voluntaristic DIY labor to upholding liberal or authoritarian politics.
And kind of digging down into the liberalism, right? The kind of actions that had been taking up a lot of space, which is like the sort of planned arrest, civil disobedience stuff. So kind of analyze that along the lines of the provocations we made. This is relying on representation, right? In a very specific way. I think people are modeling it on an idea of the 60s and 70s, and we are not in the same spectacle media landscape. There was a moment where, in the fall when some of these things got attention, similarly with the encampments, when the cops were beating up protesters in Colombia, there was some attention, but we can't rely on this sort of, invocation of moral outrage from liberals and the goodwill of the press to present case for us to do things. And that's where we've ceded a lot of ground to the kind of liberal actions. I know also just there's this history that gets told of the 60s liberatory movements, that kind of peaceful protest, civil disobedience, was made possible by riotous action, armed self-defense. But we don't have that other thing going on, right? So there is no actual threat. There was a threat maybe during George Floyd, and I think maybe we're as anarchists, hoping that will happen, but it's not, it hasn't happened. So I just wanted to kind of think about the role of representation and how we rely so much on a particular kind of representation for the things that we do to work, which is just ceding power to the establishment, to liberals, to anyone who wants to co-opt it.
It's been really interesting. I've been parts of at other moments of a presidential election, being parts of campaigns like don't just not vote, or being out in the streets to try to convince people when they're like, don't put your hope in Obama, put your hope in self-organization. And here we are where liberals and Democrats for the first time on large maps are like, wow, this election's about fascism versus fascism. We're going to do the write-in campaign saying uncommitted and 25% of people in states. And I'm like, meanwhile, anarchists are like, oh, maybe Chicago Convention will look like 1968 and there'll be lots of rioting. And I'm like, wow, the liberals are actually farther ahead of us in their pessimism about this election. And I've been really perplexed also as like, we are so clearly understand we are in fascism and that we're heading towards some new horrific version of it, but yet we're doing nothing to offer anything at this moment. Nothing that's imaginative to put out ideas about. Like, I started playing around with like, okay, I love that slogan, become ungovernable, the last time, and we really fucking were after Trump was like, right? But like, we also need to become self-governable. And, you know, Zapatistas, Rojava, there's plenty of really good examples of people doing that. Why aren't we, when we have, I've never ever heard so many Democrats say voting means nothing. And here we're like, oh, don't even know, you know, and again, I think this is coming from our despair. We don't know what to do, but we do know what to do, I think. Right? We do know examples in history of what people have done when things have fallen apart.
And I would also just like to build on that, the other strand of the argument is like bringing us to think about what we're actually doing, right? Versus how we name it or what we call it. And this is for anarchists too, not just for like the orgs. You know, like with the encampments, there was an ostensible reason for them to be set up. Like there was always demands, the top one being like disclose and divest, which like, you know, wasn't going to happen for most places. It was very unlikely. But while they were like there for that reason in the different campuses, other things were happening, right? Like the students were managing their lives, their daily lives, and having an experience of what that feels like, right? Like I was the new school encampment and students were like, we're doing anarchism, right? They didn't know until then that it was something you did. They thought it was something you like hear about or read. But, you know, that energy that goes into this like self-organization gets sapped into like, we need to drive towards these demands and get these demands met, right? So like everything ends up going towards the demand for divestment. And the thing that we're actually doing that's interesting and cool, and to me would like be a direction towards solidarity with Palestinians if we think about how to organize ourselves, which will enable us to, you know, throw off the powers that control us, that gets left in the dust, right? And people aren't actually interested in pursuing that in more conflictual ways. They just want to keep taking the action that they think could possibly get to maybe the board of trustees will vote. Maybe they'll vote yes, you know, and we all know that everyone actually knows that's not going to happen, even though that's what they keep driving towards. And meanwhile, everyone's getting arrested during this time. But to not just be negative, I want to say that there's stuff that we do, right? And like we can pull this out of this moment. Like the fact that there is this robust street movement in many cities is because of anarchists, right? They're using not just like the ideas of anarchists, but the actual labor. We're giving ourselves to them all the time. And like that has made possible. And we've seen this over like, I mean, I think it's the history of radical action. You know, anarchism has always like laid the groundwork, but for those of us like within our lifetimes, we see this happening over and over again. The anarchists do the grunt work, right? And then like PSL comes in or whatever and like leads the march to nowhere. But like we should just think about what we're doing well. And to me, like to get, again, I'm going to like start turning to the positive. Like I'm trying to think about anarchism as creating the possibility of action and the possibility to act, not with guarantees that it will be successful, but just like to act, because so many of our acts are already circumscribed and we're bribed by our own comforts within this system, even though we know that it's killing us. So to bring attention to the things that we do, which to me, like can boil down to like making life possible, right? That's the thing that ends up getting extracted from us, even by the left. And like, I want to think about how we can bring attention to that and then work from that rather than be driven by like a kind of knee-jerk reaction into repeated forms of protest that do nothing except like, you know, register outrage.
I feel like I have so many other things I wanted to talk about that are kind of like things to despair about and examples. But I also want to turn toward, like, Shuli and I both understand anarchism as how we make life possible, how we create life against a death machine, and the ways we do that. And so I want to kind of transition to that in ways we could maybe think of reorienting our despair. But I also sort of want to point inward to anarchism that has really been despairing me. There's been the outward way. I have a whole bunch of other examples, which I will not get time to, that we're not actually engaging in the ways we used to have. We used to be the proactive force that everybody else had to catch up to. And now we're watching everybody else and not putting anarchists. I feel like it's very hard to see anarchist ideas out in the world anymore. And that fucking pains me. Ashanti Olsen did a really nice little, go listen to it, a Firestorm event with 3 former longtime prisoners. It's Rattling the Cage discussion. It's a recording. And at the very end, Ashanti was asked some things to do. And Ashanti just said, we should be in movements as anarchists and as visible anarchists and as putting our ideas out there. And I think what's been happening now is a lot of people have picked up anarchist, the gloss of it or the terms of it or the words of it from the uprising, but they have no idea of the history or the practices or the lessons. And they seem oddly uncurious about it because they're like, I'm busy trying to get the university to divest. And we're not actually arguing that that's not what anarchism is and putting other ideas out there, right? Like, we're so beyond our own stuff being co-opted. If I hear diversity of tactics one more time where it's just basically about liberals are all doing things and you can do your, I was like, that's not what diversity of tactics, it started out, a bunch of us who were anarchists being able to do things simultaneously. There were different tactics, but we're fucking radical at the same time. Okay. But I also want to do, before I turn, is I think we are also broken, traumatized, hurt, etc. And I really think some of the limitations that I'm really despairing about are related to a United States version of anarchism, which is we live in such a hyper alienated, individualized, segmented, removed from each other because of a whole bunch of structural reasons. It's not just that we're bad at what we do, but we are embracing that so much in our behaviors toward each other. We're all like struggling to survive and doing our own, like, give me money or I'm this and that. And I was like, why do we not fucking collectively think about how we can all be, like, we could have strategies about, we might not come up with answers, but anarchists used to go, how can we collectively think about figuring out we all have enough to be able to act? How can we collectively think we have the infrastructure to do that? We talk about collective care, but I've never seen so many. I'm so proud that at this book fair, we're asking everyone to mask. I can barely go to any anarchist events anymore because everyone's like, oh, masks are so beyond that, past. And I'm like, are we thinking about a collective care? You might be, but as anarchists, we used to think about this collectiveness. We used to think about a rigorous critique of hierarchy. Why are we lost the kind of core ethics of anarchism that we can't even do that toward each other? The last thing I want to say, because this is making me so fucking enraged and pained and makes me cry a lot, is how we weaponize all sorts of ridiculous shit against each other and destroy each other. And the more you're out there as an anarchist, the more you will get shit thrown at you, weaponized, nothing to do with your actual practices, but when you try to point that out, no one will have your back. We are just letting each other be fucking destroyed more and more. And I'm like, I want to embrace being the most better person I can be toward everybody, not the opposite. And it pains me that anarchists are tearing each other apart. And I think that's our despair because it's so hard to understand who the hell we're supposed to be directing it at. That's why we need to pause and take time. The first week, move back to Shuli, the first week after the genocide, I literally barely left the space I was in. I was like a mess, like miserable. I reached out to every Jewish anarchist I know and started talking to them the whole time. We were all feeling the same. And I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And I was like, okay, I'm going to take this week. I'm going to reground in my values. What would I do as an anarchist, not what I would do to what's happening out in the streets. And I think it's time sometimes as anarchists, spaces like this and others, we need to do that. We need to create time and spaces for ourselves to think through this and to treat each other well in those spaces, not create spaces, which I've done repeat a couple times in the past few years, where people get together and act like their worst selves and go, oh, we're trying to experiment and wrestle together with the world. I'm not going to let you do that. Fuck that. We're going to rip this place apart. I'm like, why are we doing that? Why? The last point of this is, for me, solidarity is so key. And I've never seen so many anarchists go, I don't want to help that person who's facing a bunch of charges because we had a bad relationship breakup or, blah, blah. And I'm like, fucking if you don't like someone, you could have a bad relationship. We have to have 100% solidarity. We against what is crushing us. those seem to be used to be core anarchist values. I feel like we've lost our compass.
And so I want to go a little bit into these are some weird ideas I'm trying out, right? And one of the missing things that I think in anarchism, like Klee writes about it in the book, and like the resurgence of Jewish anarchism speaks to this, is that we don't like have a spirituality grounding us. Like we're so in this like Western Enlightenment mindset of like reason, rationality, like what's visible to us, and that's the only thing that's real, like concrete actions. And I think like when we talk about, many worlds are possible, another world is possible, we have to think about that like as a belief in these worlds. And I've seen like this is another instance with the genocide in Gaza, but it's happened over and over again in the last few years, that there's like a battle of reality. There's a battle of like whose narrative of reality is going to win. And we see the state imposing its version of reality just by brute force without as much buy-in by the people, right? There's more and more people just like, yeah, I know that that's not true, right? Especially like in these movements, we see people rising up and trying to defend what they know is real. And so I think going into this like belief and thinking about other worlds, like this is the prefigurative thing too, right? Like, yep. We can't just wait for this all to end and then we do the thing we want to do. I want to think about anarchism as something we're constantly engaging in. That world is here. We're in both. We have like a foot in both worlds. Like there's part of us that's operating in the world of survival through capitalism, and then there's the part of us that actually is what makes everything work. That's making life together. Joy James talks about it as the captive maternal. And I think it's interesting because it's something that can be taken from us, right? Like we can form a home within the prison, right? That sustains life within the prison, but we can also try to think about how we form that life as a way to tear down those walls. So I just think like, I want to kind of bring our attention to things like less like what's visible, less what's like provable, and think about like where our like anarchist belief is, and then connect that to this collective sort of making life possible that we're always doing.
Yep. As part of that, I've been thinking a lot the last few years about anarchism as, and maybe this comes to the Jewish anarchist lens, as de-assimilating from a world that stole everything from us starting in 1492, from Jews, Muslims, Black people, indigenous people, queer and female bodies. And we have more in common against those struggles, but they've taken everything from us: time, calendars, ways of culture. And so for me, us returning to forms of ritual, to not abide by their time, not abide by their languages, their cultural ways, it totally breaks ecological thinking. That's why I'm doing rituals all the time now, to remind us that we had all sorts of wisdoms and we need to take them back and open up space to share them with each other. People doing that in the streets I have been really proud of Jews and Muslims doing a lot of ritual in the street during this moment. And sometime happened to be in Pittsburgh and went to the encampment and did multiple rituals with just Jews and with Muslims and with Jews and Muslims together. And we were all crying. We were like, this is what fucking solidarity is. This is what they don't understand. They're fighting about trying to maintain borders and states. And here we are looking up at the moon together, thinking about what's sacred together. Like that's really fucking militant to do that. Ritual. I really see ritual as militant, right? And the second thing I see as militant and life-giving is remembrance and storytelling and curiosity. When you meet people, asking them about them, who they're, what they care about, asking each other what struggles we've been involved in, what sorrows we have. Tell our stories of resistance. One reason I do books, and especially anthologies, is I want to give lots of voices of us to tell our practices to each other. Forms of storytelling, both written and oral, is really beautiful way to remind us there's a history to what we did. I was also here. There was a teeny little encampment with about 8 or 12 students who were so adorable. They're like, we know almost nothing. We're not ready, but we want to be in this for the long haul. So we just want to have lots of conversations and have people come help us with trainings. And they didn't do much of anything but sit around preparing themselves for being in struggle for a long time. And it fucking broke my heart that they were doing that, having those conversations. And they just started wanting to hear stories about things and other times of resistance. Maybe that's the beginning of us remembering that we've been doing forms of self-organizing and self-governance and self-determination for millennia against their ability to try to crush us again and again. I really do take seriously this time as the time of fascism. Maybe it's like my epigenetic ancestral trauma coming through. And it's been real. If you've ever read the book Blessed is the Flame, I sort of like parts of it, don't like parts of it, but I like the premise, which also I agree with, is when you are in a concentration camp or Gaza, or a moment where it feels like there is nothing but sure death. And I think we're all in a little bit of denial about how close we are to how incredibly dangerous these times are for most of us right now, right? That what it looks like to resist shifts. And what resistance looks like often is making life and not letting them erase you. And if they're going to kill you, they're not going to kill your culture. They're not going to kill your language. So these beautiful examples of people in Shoah, in Blessed is the Flame, there's an example from a memoir I loved that I read before I read Blessed in the Flame, where someone who was had to do the gas crematoria in Auschwitz was writing down the names of people they knew that came through there and burying them in tin cans, hoping someday someone would find their names. I was like, that's resistance. We will not be forgotten. And now when you look at Gaza, the resistance, arms struggle or struggle with rocks, yes, resistance. And the resistance is the hospitals are being destroyed. People are doing their own hospitals. Food's being taken away. People are figuring out inventive ways to feed each other. Ramadan was stolen from them. They're doing Ramadan. We are in a moment where we have to make life at the same time and see that as our prefiguration, right? Even if we think we will not survive this moment ourselves, ancestors before us struggled and people after us will, right? So the last thing I want to say, and I'll turn back to Shuli, is I hope we can do that by going on the offensive as anarchists. I'm really proudly an anarchist, and I will be an anarchist, I hope, for the rest of my life. And I always love talking, and I think the more it's okay to be an anarchist who's both provocational and agitational and conflictual and oppositional, because we hate everything that's hierarchy structure. But I also am always about here's what it's called the beautiful idea. We need to go on the offensive of showing what that beautiful idea is. At the same time, we're critiquing hierarchy simultaneously. And part of the way we do that is through creativity and play and experimentation and not knowing what we're doing and taking risks that we don't even know what's going to happen. Like this book fair, we're like, let's try doing something in the park last night. And I was just like, oh my God, there's hundreds of people at this park. I was just like, these moments where you don't know what's going to happen and you just do it. Because that's how we're going to get back to understanding who we are in the world. Go.
I just want to build up that because that's something I think about a lot, and I want to connect this to the idea that we don't always name what we do well, or we don't think it's important or worth talking about. But the book fair feels like maybe incidental to the struggle, but what it shows us is our ability to make these things happen, and also to believe in the coming together, right? Because I've organized this book fair many times, and there's a point beyond which you have no control. You don't know what's going to happen. And you just have to trust that when people show up, the thing happens, right? And I think that's part of how we see anarchism kind of come into being in the world, is through this kind of spontaneous eruption that we can do because we know how to make things happen. So the same thing that, makes a book fair happen helps get people hormones when they're being attacked, or abortions, or whatever, or whatever kind of healthcare. We do these things and we move them into different spaces. Yeah, I guess maybe maybe we can turn it over to discussion. I'll bring it into a kind of a question. We can think about the things that we'd be afraid to propose because we think they would be rejected for not being militant enough or whatever on this model, this ultimately this liberal protest model. What do you think is actually impossible, but you would want to try? Or if the normal array of actions weren't available to you, from burning a cop car to, writing a petition, right? If you couldn't have any of these things on the table, what would you do? What things could you do? I want to, and, to invoke Klee again, because he talks about the unknowable, right? Anarchism is this unknowable. Things that can't be known are seen by the power structure, are the things that ultimately can't be recuperated, like the resistance in Gaza. Yeah. So, maybe that's a good kind of provocation to you all.
And maybe to add to that thought experiment I've been trying to do, I really like that idea of trying not to see like the state. Jason Scott talking about we try to be not legible to the state, but we know what we're doing. Like this book fair, people driving by don't know what it is, but we know what we're doing here and all the self-organization and volunteer that it takes to make this happen. But I think right now it would also, to add to that, for us to really rigorously do a thought experiment is to try not to see like colonialism, to try not to see like the state, to try not to see like patriarchy and capitalism. What would we do. Murray Bookchin was a big mentor of mine and friend, and was always like, what are we going to replace everything with we don't want? And even if we don't know what that is, what do we start dreaming it might be? So the same thing.
It's time for a break. Now back to the conversation.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes. So unfortunately, yeah. You want to go?
Obviously, I think about this a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of parallels between just the experience of being, a genocided people, a native, obviously we have a lot of shared struggle and stuff. And I think one thing that I see, not just like my people, but everyone struggling with a lot is just like being able to hold a range of emotions at once. Like there's something obviously like despair, rage, anger is so like profoundly strong right now, but also like this revolutionary love feels like amazing. Like seeing the joy of like buildings being burned down and seeing the joy of like these students making a lot of mistakes at the encampment. And so I think that we can simultaneously like be experiencing despair and also be in love with the resistance. And I think that feels like a really big, just like skill, like having like interpersonal skills and relationship skills, I think is actually really fucking us up right now.
Yeah.
Like, or just, this stupid fucking identity politics shit, in the area I live in, I'm also white. That's a huge fucking problem, that I am also white. And so it limits me from the other like natives around me because because of that, I don't understand what the fuck genocide is. Like, regardless of me being separated from, my indigenous mother through her deportation and going missing and shit. And so I think that like just emotional capacity and interpersonal skills as living in this like, colonial American state have never been encouraged. And so we really fucking need to do that. We need to learn how to hold each other in a way that's like, I want to rip off your fucking head, but I also want to like hold your heart and be there with you and stuff. And we don't do that. And I think that is also something returning to ritual as well. Like conflict can be a fucking ritual.
Yeah.
Tension is a ritual. Rebellion, that's a fucking ritual. Yeah. For a lot of people of various indigenous identities, we've had a lot of that erased. And so, like, why not come up with these new ways of doing that? It doesn't have to be everything from tradition or whatever, because not everyone has that anymore. So I think my rant's over. I'm not sure.
Okay, I just want to say that I love what you said.
Me too.
And coming from like kind of like the gay liberation, thinking about gay liberation, which often people talk about as a failure because queer sex didn't actually end capitalism. I think what it tells us is like that we can't have a revolution that doesn't give us something worth, like that doesn't answer to our pleasure and our desires.
Yeah.
Right. And like that's the thing that is often missing, right? Like, and even when we say like that was a failure, we're missing the fact that there was like all this pleasure that was had in trying to pursue that. So I just like what you said made me think about that. I wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, thanks love was on my list. So I wish we would all like actually say we love each other in this really expansive thing or two, like a rebellion flood. So we only have about 5 more minutes or so. Okay.
Everyone I'm about to talk about, as a Jewish person whose family fled pogroms in the Ukraine and then were participating in settler colonialism in the Midwest after the Buffalo Wars and the clearing of the Homestead Act, I feel like white leftists never gave a shit about Jews my entire life. And I feel like I've been scapegoated for talking a not white Christian internalized way.
Yep.
I want to say out of compassion for my Goy comrades that have dominated the conversation until very recently, the despair is a byproduct of the Protestant worldview that we are not of this world and that we're not supposed to find news. We're supposed to shut up and despair and hope we get picked.
Yeah.
That's literally what the Protestant Reformation, that's what Calvinism is. And this country and Western Europe are inseparable from that becoming the dominant threat of Christianity, because those are people that became the original capitalists and overthrew the kings. And so when you say, oh, with this despair, I want to say there's a gentrification of the mind that happens where we're letting our white friends off the hook. And I'm white, I'm Jewish, and I'm white, but we're letting the Christians, the people who internalized a Protestant Christianity that is essentially a death cult, and then they just were like, fuck that, my racist parents, I'm going to go be an anarchist now. And they believe that despair is what they deserve. And they believe that suffering and self-sacrifice. And I don't believe in cancel culture. That's white people appropriating African-American vernacular English and not refusing to look at the fact that that's Puritan, shun, and banish culture.
Yeah.
That my ancestors had to assimilate to, and it murdered them and sent them into mental health and alcoholism. Yeah. And I see the same shit happening. Sorry, I'm using strong language. Where people are banishing each other. They're using sectarian violence against one another because that's what their ancestors had to do to assimilate to whiteness. And now they're sitting around going, oh, why does this keep happening? It's like, because you didn't kill the fucking cop in your head. Yeah. You didn't kill the buckle-headed genocider in your head. And now you're just wanting to shrug it off because now it's in vogue. I want to say I respect both of you. Yeah. You said the genocide started on 10/7. No, it didn't.
No, I know that.
I know, I'm saying it, but you said that aloud. And there are people who are new here. They're like, oh my God, genocide. Okay. The military campaign to ethnically cleanse Gaza was initiated based on response to 10/7. But none of that, that's even the attacks of 10/7 are a response to actual ethnic cleansing that's ongoing in the West Bank. That isn't what we talk about. The posters are free Gaza. Yeah. The posters are maybe free Palestine, but they're not. What the fuck with the settlers in the West Bank? I'm sorry, I know.
Oh, no. I know. I just thank you for doing that.
Because there is a gentrification of mind, to quote Sarah Schulman, where we get to a point where we're like, oh, we've arrived at this moment. No, we haven't. Multiple strands are creating this moment, and there are people with the privilege to look at a half side of it because it makes them feel hideous and ugly because they're patterned to do that automatically. Yeah. No one should be ashamed that they didn't know about this until now. But the fact that people need to fake the funk to feel like they belong, that's ancestral violence reenacting in their body. And as a Jewish person, I'm so fucking sick of having to mask and let these people feel like they're the ones. Yeah. And I'm supposed to hide my rage, and I'm supposed to be happy now that there's a moment that people are like, oh, wow, yeah, anti-Semitism and anti-Israel aren't the same thing. You're like, I didn't even know what the fuck Israel was 3 years ago. I see my time.
And actually, I love this. We're actually buddies, and this is how Jews talk to each other. I love it. Like, and you do it, everyone's like, people right. And I'm like, this is what I love. And this to me,
you're like, boy, I'm saying this.
I know, and this is what we need to be doing. This is actually modeling what we need to be doing. Of course, I know there was genocide before, but when you sit down, you start pushing each other. And then it makes me think, oh, one other thing I didn't talk about was we've lost the ability to historicize and remember and connect things across time and space. And so we have shorthands and things because we're doing talks that only have, blah, blah. And that's actually not helpful for us thinking through. And also that despair about us really examining what kind of fascism is in the United States is not Nazis in Germany or all sorts of the world right now. There's a very peculiar white Christian supremacist fascism that has been here, that founded the United States, and we barely ever interrogate that, much less how it has gentrified.
Violent, radical, racist Zionism is not a culture of despair. It is emerged as a death cult, but it emerged out of a utopian project that was co-opted by National Socialists who are themselves trying to create a freer society. Different. Yeah. It's a different story than the Protestants here that were like, death, death, death.
All to say is get together with people and have these incredible conversations where everyone looks and goes, oh my God, they must be mad at each other. And we're like, no, this is love. Okay. Love in action. Okay.
I just think it's also important that you added to that this is internal work that we have to do to take this shit out of us, because that is another reason I think we're never ready for anything, because we're acting it out amongst each other, policing each other. We can't have anything happen without someone hurting each other, and then we have to do a process that doesn't fucking work. Yeah. So I think that internal stuff, which is I think the white Christian kind of death cult was a perfect word. I loved what you said.
I'm sorry to be, this is so ridiculous, the book fair, we're militant schedule. Okay. And even though I'm time, space mean nothing. Or there's two, maybe you both two of you both each just want to say something each, and then we can just wrap up. I think you, right? Sorry.
Me.
Yeah. And then you. Yeah.
It's kind of I thought I'm so familiar speaking back into how this particular brand of anarchism and southern communities in the United States and how that's formed around individualism.
this isolation, I think something too that I think a lot about is the ways of like still trying to like get it together, right? But like how we can like hold on to this like identity of anarchism and like ways that can become like, I remember earlier when you were saying like you don't want to like call people like not anarchists and stuff like that, and like you just fuck the concept of that. Like I think like thinking about how people can be so afraid to like talk to people who are not anarchists, and like not even like, I'm not saying like liberals, I'm not saying like authoritarian leftists, but just like people who are not like anarchists and like building. And I think that, like, especially when talking about prefigurative things, it's so important to think about, do we mean like the anarchists that we know? Do we the people who already identify as anarchists? Or like also how are we thinking about how we like build with like other people and like thinking about like where our values align? And I don't know. That's just something I think a lot about. That's very quick, huh?
No, it's great. Great.
Thank you.
And do you want to
I could like really quickly
maybe up a little volume so people can hear?
one thing that
Sorry to do
really loud.
Okay. Okay.
Something that I am despairing about and I just want to put in the space is the absolute like silence and just lack of discussion on like the violence and like the massive scale of violence that non-human animals are experiencing. Like it's like we're talking billions right now. And I'm really sad because I thought that maybe this year at this anarchist book fair, there would be some discussion around it. Last year, there was no discussion about it. And one of the tactics that is like liberal tactics, like liberal co-opting of this discussion is like just making it about like, I'm vegan, you're not, like you're vegan, you're not vegan. Like there's like veganism is not, it's not about veganism. It's about like animals, like sentient animals, billions of sentient animals are being so oppressed and like are experiencing such like, it's just violence. And I just want us to talk about it more. And I want us to stop using veganism as a way to like co-opt this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, we have like 2 minutes before it's time. So I don't know. Yeah, I wish we had more time because I would love to hear from more of you all. And I really appreciate the two final kind of thoughts. I don't want to actually say that much more because I said a lot already.
Okay.
Do you want to say anything?
I guess I just really want to encourage people I was talking to someone here who I think is here. I can't see very well from here because of lighting. We were talking about having been anarchists for a long time in this continent we're on. There used to be lots of like anarchist get-togethers to do nothing but like wrestle with ideas together and introduce people to ideas and introduce people to practices. And I hope we can, all of you, take maybe the biggest provocation of this is to find a few people that you have affinity with instead of worrying about whether they are a checkpoint of identities or someone, whatever. And thank you for the reminder of that point recently. And have these conversations and really push each other to think through what feels, maybe despair is not even the right word, what just feels limiting right now and challenging and obstacles, and how we want to push ourselves based on our values. And then I really do want to end on that. I'm more and more about, I've never been like, I don't think I'm going to be the person to decide who's an anarchist or not. But now I'm like most anarchists, a huge number of anarchists now are rad liberals. And I do not know what to do with that. So I'm just exhausted and they keep baiting. And I've never been baited as an anarchist more by people that say they're anarchists, but they're rad liberals. So I'm at this point where I'm like, I'm looking at people's practices. I don't care what you call yourselves. And I think and that makes us open to looking at more possibilities, right? That's going to open us up to a whole bunch of different worlds that we're missing out on, forms of self-organization and autonomy, and people that actually also take seriously a critique of hierarchy and in its place, the beautiful idea. So I really encourage everybody to go do this with friends more and more and hang out, keep doing, and then I hope there's a lot more visible anarchy after this book fair everywhere. So thanks everybody for
You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. Rate, follow us, share us with your exes. Until next time. Bye.